The first responders in Colorado who administered ketamine to Elijah McClain before he died during his 2019 arrest have been found guilty by a jury in Aurora. Now, Jeremy Cooper and Peter Sikchunik have been found responsible for his fatal overdose. So this was a story that we've been covering since 2020. In fact, the story got very little media attention since it happened in 2019, but the protests that were carried out in the summer of 2020 drew attention to it. So as a reminder, here are the events of what happened the day that Elijah McClain was killed. Now, 23-year-old Elijah McClain was stopped by police officers in Aurora, Colorado on August 24th of 2019 after someone had called in and alerted the authorities about a suspicious looking person in the neighborhood. Now, the reason why the caller felt that McClain looked suspicious was because he was wearing a ski mask, but it turns out that McClain was wearing that ski mask because he had a medical issue, a circulation problem that made him feel extremely cold. So his face would get cold and he wore that mask in order to stay warm. The caller also shared concern that McClain was waving his hands as he listened to earbuds. Maybe he was enjoying the music. I mean, I don't know why that looks suspicious, but the caller also noted that to the authorities. As officers sought to detain McClain, he protested that he wanted to be left alone. For good reason, he hadn't done anything wrong. He couldn't understand why cops were stopping him. One officer claimed that McClain reached for his gun, prompting another to apply a chokehold on the young man within a minute of their encounter. The officer was convicted of homicide and third-degree assault earlier this year, while two officers were acquitted and one is back working on the Aurora Police Department. Now, that was what the police officers had carried out. But the second half of this interaction with McClain had to do with the first responders who arrived to the scene, because they had administered, what the prosecutors called lethal dose of ketamine, and that is what ultimately ended McClain's life. Medical responders arrived about 15 minutes later, and paramedics injected him with the ketamine, which is a very powerful sedative. It's actually used on horses, for instance. Now, McClain went into cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital, and he died a few days later. According to prosecutors, the paramedics failed to perform essential medical assessments on McClain, neglecting basic checks like taking his pulse before administering the ketamine. Experts testified that the dosage was excessive for someone of McClain's size. He was only 140 pounds. Additionally, prosecutors assert that the paramedics did not monitor McClain promptly after administering the sedative. Instead, they left him on the ground, exacerbating difficulties in breathing. The almost 4-week-long trial is the last of all the trials seeking to bring justice to McClain and his family. The jury found the paramedics guilty of criminally negligent homicide. Both medical professionals were also charged with assault. Sikchunik was found guilty of one of the assault charges, second-degree assault, for the unlawful administration of drugs, while Cooper was not found guilty of the assault charges. The two paramedics who have not been sentenced yet could spend years behind bars. We don't know what their sentences are yet. The hearing for that will happen later. The city of Aurora, though, has said that the two have been fired following their convictions. So, John, I wanted to ask you what you think about this. I thought that administering the ketamine, especially after the chokehold, and just leaving him there to suffer and have difficulty breathing was an injustice, and the jury feels the same way. Now, paramedics are concerned, and some local authorities in Aurora, Colorado are concerned that this sets a terrible precedent for paramedics, because now they might be afraid to administer sedatives in cases where they typically would feel it's justified to do so. What are your thoughts on that?
Maybe they should be more concerned about willy-nilly administering overdoses of sedatives. I mean, and if they're worried about pressure from the cops or something, provide them with legal protections from pressure from the cops. I could definitely see doing that, but I mean, I think the immediate problem, the longstanding historic problem, is a lack of concern for the inherent value of certain members of certain groups' lives, including especially young black men. That's the longstanding problem that definitely has not received the attention it deserves. If it turns out that the paramedic thing becomes a problem, we can address it. But we've got only hundreds of years of history of law enforcement not giving a damn about whether people like Elijah McClain live or die. That I feel like is the more pressing issue. This entire case, and I'd honestly forgotten about this for the past like 2 years or whatever, even though there have been some updates. It feels like it was generated by ChatGPT to include every way that like people are failed, like young black men like him are failed. In that the behaviors of wearing a ski mask and moving while listening to music, those are descriptions that are used to imply that he was being erratic or suspicious or something that only apply to people like him. Any random person doing that would not be considered to be a lethal threat. He's 140 pounds. You couldn't just hold him down.
Right.
Like
there were multiple officers on the scene.
Multiple officers, and then also generally the way that they justify lethal force. In this case, I know that it took a while for the drugs to kill him, but usually is he has some sort of weapon or he has something in his hand, so it seems like a weapon. But they also have the backup of, well, if he doesn't have a weapon, I have a weapon. And his hand is near my weapon.
Exactly, that's the,
so now.
Yeah.
Well, here's the way
claim they always make.
If you're really worried about someone grabbing your gun and shooting you, a great way to avoid that is to not have a lethal weapon on your body. And then there's nothing for a person to grab, as if the 140-pound kid is gonna get it out of your holster and turn it on you against multiple cops. Don't have the lethal weapon, and it can't be turned on you. And so just every step of the way, it's like their diagnosis of him as having superhuman strength. He's 140 pounds.
Yeah, look, the cops need to have a lethal weapon in a country that's swimming with guns, in a country that has all sorts of criminals that are heavily armed, right? Like I get why cops need to have the weapon. However, this is what I would say. I don't begrudge anyone who sees an individual with a ski mask and feels a little concerned, because when you see someone wearing a ski mask, what is that usually associated with, right? However, it is the job of the authorities to just ask some questions before escalating the situation. I think that's where things started to go wrong. The cops show up, and it's almost as if they automatically assumed that Elijah McClain was engaged in something criminal. Elijah McClain, prior to that interaction with the authorities, was in a convenience store, literally paying for whatever he was buying at the convenience store. We have footage of him, surveillance footage of him at that convenience store. Obviously, he didn't do anything wrong, because if he were some sort of robber or burglar, typically these are the types of people who wear the ski masks, he wouldn't be paying for items at the convenience store. So my point in mentioning all of that is, it is the job of the authorities to ask questions and actually investigate the claims or concerns made by the caller to determine whether Elijah McClain or the person who's been called about is a danger or is engaging in any criminality. There was no evidence of that whatsoever. The only thing was that he was wearing a ski mask. That is not enough to justify escalating the situation to the point where you put a 140-pound guy in a chokehold and then administer a super strong sedative, ketamine, in order to sedate him.
Yeah.
And then leave him on the ground without providing the proper care to ensure he doesn't die of an overdose as a result of that ketamine being administered into his incredibly light body. 140 pounds is nothing.
Yeah, he's a kid.
Anyway, look, I don't mean to drudge up like the injustices that happened, leading up to his death, because in reality, we should at least celebrate the fact that there was some justice in this case. There are far too many stories involving, an innocent person getting killed by the authorities, and then there's no justice. And we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in the way that our justice system handles cases like this. And I think it's a good thing. And to your point earlier, John, I agree with you. I think the paramedics should hesitate before they administer powerful sedatives like this. They should do the proper, questioning prior to doing what the paramedics did in this case. You want to help save lives, and I'm sure most paramedics feel that way. And so if this is going to cause some to maybe question whether they're gonna administer a sedative or carry out some certain action, good. I think that's what the point of this outcome is.